very happy to be here and introduce Barry Jaruzelski. Barry goes back quite a long way with my firm and with me. We got started doing spin-outs, which is what we're still dedicated to doing, as a captive unit inside Lucent Technologies when Lucent was a very young company. It had just been spun out itself from AT&T. At the time, it was the largest IPO in history. But ironically, while it was viewed as a dynamic startup, it had only recently been a captive, I would say quite insulated equipment manufacturer for one of the world's largest quasi-governmental monopolies for AT&T. And Barry and I first met in the cafeteria at the headquarters of Lucent, where I was beginning to look for cool technologies that were stranded and could become the basis for new ventures for us to spin out. And what Barry was doing was trying to advise the executive team of Lucent on basically how to raise the world's biggest baby, which is what Lucent was at the time, and turn it from something which had been sort of slow and protected into something which was commercial and agile and ultimately quite successful. As the next slide will show you a bit of Barry's background, he is a true guru on the topic of innovation. He is the partner at Booz Allen, or Booz now. Booz Company. Sorry for that. They changed their names. Who leads the global innovation practice. Booz is one of the leading consulting firms on the planet that makes Barry a person in a great position to have a bird's eye view of how innovation works or doesn't work at a wide variety of companies all around the world. I'd say that Barry is the third of 3 consulting gurus on innovation to speak to you at this conference. As you'll see, Barry brings his own unique, particular perspective to the study of innovation. As befits a New Jersey public school boy who voluntarily took 5 years of Latin, his perspective is rigorous, disciplined, at its base, very quantitative. But at the same time, he brings the same rigor and discipline to extracting qualitative so whats. What does all the data mean from the numbers? And so with that, I'll turn it over to Barry to talk about the last 6 years of study of the Global Innovation 1000 and the learnings that he has gleaned from them. At the end, I'll kick off the Q&A with a little bit of fireside chat style, but I want you guys to keep in mind that the mic will become yours and start jotting your questions down.
Well, thanks, Rob. Hopefully I can live up to that kind introduction. I know I have a bit of a challenge here. I'm all that's standing between you and lunch. And someone from Booz, I'm not sure whether that's better than standing between you and cocktails, but we'll see. So what I'm going to sort of share with you is, Booz, going back to Booz Company and then Booz Allen, our predecessor firm, has been involved in the innovation arena for almost 50 years, going back to the initial Harvard Business Review article in 1950 on product lifecycle management. But what I'm chiefly going to talk to you about is what we've really sort of deduced over the last 6 years through our Innovation 1000 study, which is an umbrella area of investigation of what really makes a difference in terms of innovation and what really correlates with corporate performance. And in particular, how much does money matter versus a lot of other things in terms of actually delivering performance that's rooted in R&D investments and innovation. And going back to 2005, we basically wanted to test a fundamental hypothesis. Does how much you spend really matter versus your competitors? Clearly it matters some, but how much does it really matter? And building on that foundation by really going to the data, which is kind of our ilk about how we approach these things, we've investigated what really seems to make measurable difference over time and what doesn't make so much difference over time. And I'm going to share you a little bit of the highlights of 6 years of research and several thousand man days of work that have been invested in in looking at this point, mainly from a big corporate point of view as opposed to the small entrepreneurial point of view, but I think a lot of the fundamental principles still hold. So just kind of to give you a foundation of where have we been looking and doing our investigation. And we focus on what we call the Innovation 1000, which is the 1,000 largest public companies in the world in terms of how much they spend on R&D. And we do this every year, and it's pretty easy to look at the US and Western Europe and Japan, but when you want to roll in everything, South Africa, Israel, China, India, Brazil, et cetera, it gets a little more challenging. Those 1,000 largest companies spent, in 2009, $503 billion on R&D. That's 48% of all the R&D expended by everyone on the planet. That's government, universities, public companies, private companies, et cetera. 48% of it's done by the Innovation 1000. The biggest, Roche, a little over 9.1 billion. The cutoff to be the 1,000 was a Japanese healthcare products company at 59 million. So it falls off pretty fast. It's pretty concentrated. The other 12% that isn't government or the Innovation 1000 is everybody else. The Innovation 2000 and every small startup or private company on the planet is just in that last 12%. Not a big surprise. It's dominated by high-tech, health, and auto companies. They represent 71% of the spend of those companies. And it's dominated by companies headquartered, not necessarily operating, but headquartered in Europe, the US, or Japan. Now, the interesting thing is it's to remember, and several people have been alluding to things like this over the last 2 days, major multinationals, 91% of major multinationals execute R&D in countries other than their home country. Doesn't mean they don't do it in their home, but they also do it around the globe. And so when you look at it, the big 3 countries in terms of corporate R&D activity, spending, US, Japan, Germany are 1, 2, 3. But if you look at where R&D is actually done, it's US, number 1, Japan, number 2, and number 3 is a tie. 2 years ago it was a tie. I'm sure it's no longer a tie, is Germany and China. So there's as much R&D done in China 2 years ago by major multinationals as there is in all of Germany. And I think it's probably, the lines have probably crossed in the last 2 years. The last thing I would just sort of highlight is that clearly there's a lot going on outside of the big corporations. But if you think about private sector R&D, how well or how badly these 1,000 companies do, really kind of what makes a huge difference on innovation on the whole planet. And this is an eye chart, I'll grant you, but this is just the top 20. It's dominated by big pharma and biotech, the auto companies because they spend an average amount, but on huge revenue basis and high tech. And it's been pretty constant over the last 10 years. The only big change is the auto companies keep falling. When we started doing this, Ford and GM were usually trading places for first or second on R&D spending. Now it's number 1 is Roche and number 2 is Microsoft in terms of total spend. The other thing that's worth noting is these 20 companies represent 130 billion of R&D spend. 12% of all the activity in the entire world is by these 20 firms. But the thing that we've always been pressing on is, well, how much does what you spend really impact how well you do? And last year, actually for the first time, we actually went out and reached out to 1,000 of the most senior R&D executives around the planet and said, well, who do you actually think are the most innovative companies out there? And probably not a huge surprise to anybody in the room, Apple came out number 1. Over 70% of the people said Apple's the most innovative company in the world. Google was not too far behind, and about 50% of the people named Google as one of the 3 most innovative. But number 3 was 3M. And those are actually the only 3 companies that actually scored double digits in terms of perceptions of R&D leaders around the world as the consistently most innovative companies around the planet. Now, the thing that we always think is interesting is only 3 of the 10 largest spenders in the world on R&D are actually on the list of the 10 most innovative companies. And also, we find somewhat interesting, which is kind of over on the right side there, that if you look at the averages, corrected for industry differences of the 10 most innovative companies in the world, they consistently outperform the 10 biggest spenders on R&D around the globe in terms of growth, profitability, market cap growth. Pick your metric of corporate goodness. And also kind of interesting, the poster child for innovativeness, Apple, they're 81st in the world in terms of R&D spend. They are not even in the top 25 in computer electronics companies around the world in terms of how much they spend on R&D. They're 26th. And actually, R&D as a percent of sales has been going down at Apple every year for the past 5 years. And with their latest revenue growth, it's even going to, it's even going to shrink more. They're spending more on an absolute basis, but as a percent of sales, it keeps shrinking. And they're not even in the top 25 in their competitor set. So that kind of leads to going back 6 years when we decided to really test our hypothesis that based on our experience, sure, money matters, but it actually isn't the differentiator in how well people do. It's a lot of other things that make the difference. And so being the sort of analytical wonks we tend to be, we went out and tested the data. And we tested it over 10,000 different ways, looking for relationships between corporate performance, whether it be growth, profitability, TSR, market cap, and people's R&D investments, leading, lagging, on a relative basis, on an absolute basis. And we always came out with the same answer. There is no statistically significant relationship between how much you spend and how well you do. It's the softer things around process, talent, capabilities that actually are the differentiators between mediocre performance and superior performance. There's only one exception to that. And this is not to have the financiers and the CFOs in the room run out and zero out everybody's R&D and engineering budgets. Sometimes there is an inclination by some people to do that. I'm not advocating that. But what we do see, and this is the only thing that is statistically significant, as long as you're out not in the bottom 10% of your peer group, as long as you get over that minimum threshold, being in the middle of the pack or being in the 90th percentile and how much you spend on R&D makes no difference in how well you do. The differences are all around capabilities, talent, process, and things of that nature. And the 5 things that we've consistently seen, both analytically, by surveys, by interviews, and by decades of client work, really fall into 5 basic buckets. And some of these may sound like motherhood and apple pie or like, duh, I mean, of course. But you'd be surprised how often they don't actually happen, particularly with large multi-line corporations. The first is the quality of the alignment between the corporate business strategy and the innovation strategy. Now you would think, of course, you're going to align how you're spending your R&D and how you're executing your innovation and your goals with your business strategy. Surprisingly frequently, this doesn't happen. Bob was making reference to our earlier points in our careers where our paths crossed. Parts of that particular company, who will remain nameless, at least by me, were not aligned at all. And there was one division at that company at the time where only 13% of the R&D budget actually could be tied to the strategy. And it was just, there was legacy investments that were continuing to be invested in that actually had nothing to do with the go-forward growth strategy. And those are often fairly common situations. Second, the quality of the global network you've built for innovation. And this is not only access to low-cost talent, it's access to talent, period, or wherever it is around the globe, and having a footprint in the markets you're trying to tackle. Because it's very hard to design for the needs of another geography when you don't have people who actually understand the customers in that geography. The third, and probably the single most important factor we've seen, is deep end customer, end user insight. This is actually the one area where we've seen huge statistically significant relationships with performance. Companies that rely on direct insight on how end users of their product actually behave and want. And I said end user because sometimes your end user is not your direct customer. And this is one of the biggest swingers in overall performance. Fourth, around portfolio management, how you actually manage the portfolio and how you make decisions of what to do and what to kill. Probably not a big surprise there, but this is a huge issue in terms of how well you actually do with your innovation investments. And the final piece is looking at the entire R&D, engineering, innovation space as a set of business processes that you run with speed, efficiency, and discipline. That it's not just a creative black box. It's a business process that has to be run with that kind of rigor. So let me touch on the first part around strategy. Through the work we've done, we've really identified 3 fundamental innovation strategies. And most companies' strategy can be boiled into one of these 3 areas. And we've looked at this based on inputs around how people think about incremental versus breakout change, what's their strategy be about being first to market versus a fast follow, and other kind of elements of the core elements of the link between business and innovation strategy. The first one is what we call need seekers. And this is kind of the quintessential, I know my customers better than they know themselves. And the companies that succeed and are particularly adept at this strategy are the ones that know the customer and the end user so well they can identify unarticulated needs. Not just consolidate a list of wants that a customer articulates, but understand the customer behavior enough to come up with ideas and opportunities the customer hadn't even thought of. And you can see some of the usual suspects here. Apple clearly fits into this realm. But the key thing is deep customer understanding with an orientation of being first to market with the results of that understanding. And it's not necessarily new science or new technology. It may be just a smarter application of that science or technology. Second, market readers, the classic fast follower strategy. This is around spending as much time watching your competitors as you watch your customers to try to understand them. And this is, I'm not going to be first to market, I'm going to be second to market. Typically, these companies spend half as much on R&D as either 2 categories, but they do very well at it. It's a fast response, not necessarily me too, but a fast response to identified innovations that others have brought to market first. And the third one is probably the one many of us are most comfortable with or are sort of easy to think about, what we call technology drivers. This is more taking your science base, developing new technologies, and kind of pushing them out for application. It's more of a science first. Now, all of these strategies involve understanding your customers. A lot of this is the relative weight you put on incremental versus breakthrough, deep versus indirect understanding of customers, and whether it's market need first versus science first in terms of how you approach the market. Interesting thing, if it's well executed and well aligned with strategy, the financial results are equal across all these strategies. The failures of these strategies are poor sets of capabilities or poor alignment with the business strategy. But all of these can be equally successful in terms of growth and profitability. And if you think about it, I mean, you have very well regarded, just in the high-tech space, Apple in need seekers. We would put Samsung, in most cases, in market readers, where they're really following the innovations of others. They're doing a very good job themselves. And Google, much more pushing technology out for application as opposed to against needs. So very powerful strategies that can cut across every industry. And interestingly, we've looked at over 800 companies. About half of them fall into the tech driver category, and about a quarter into each of the other 2 strategies. And they're all represented across every industry. The only sort of exception is in consumer packaged goods. Consumer packaged goods tends to have a lot more market readers than the other 2, but all are represented pretty much in every industry group we've looked at. So what does matter? And what we've put a lot of emphasis on is looking at capabilities. That if you have this strategy, there are a set of capabilities that are going to be different to be successful at each of those strategies. And what we've found by really focusing on how the top 25% performers in each strategy go about attacking that market is that there's a set of capabilities that they pick and focus on, trying not to be good at everything, being good at a subset of capabilities that are common across every strategy. You can think about translating customer requirements into product definition. You can think about product platform management. These things are common to top performers against every strategy. But when you start looking at each of these strategies in a differentiated way, there are certain capabilities that really matter to only 1 or 2 of the strategies and are not critical. It doesn't mean you don't do it at all, but I don't have to be 5 out of 5 in terms of capabilities, in terms of being successful at that strategy. In the case of market readers, it's all around fast response. So things around resource management, market potential assessment, rigorous decision making to quickly jump on and deploy resources when somebody else has surfaced an idea are the things that really matter. If you're if you're a need seeker or a tech driver, actually things like open innovation are really important because you're trying to stay on the cutting edge of both market needs and customer wants and technology. If you're a market reader, open innovation really doesn't matter because you're relying on your competitors' open innovation for you to find an idea to copy. And so what we found is that the top performers in each of these innovation strategies is actually picking which handful of capabilities they're going to excel at. And they're either going to be sort of mediocre or moderate at the rest of the capability set, or actually, as somebody pointed out earlier today, like an Apple, not even do some of those capabilities at all. They're going to let a partner do it for them. And they're going to pick their bets on a very select set of things they're going to excel at. And the thing that's interesting is if you look at the top performers by strategy and the bottom 25% performers by strategy, in some cases, the top performers are actually worse than bottom performers at certain capabilities. And in the lower left-hand corner, there's reverse engineering. Well, market leaders actually are worse than the average or even the bottom 25% performers at reverse engineering because it doesn't matter. People are reverse engineering what they're doing. They're not actually very good at it. But the things they are particularly good at and really excel, by leaps and bounds, bottom performers in each strategy are open innovation, deep and directly generated customer insights, strategic decision-making around portfolio bets. And interestingly, the biggest swings between bottom and top performers are not in the core product development process. They're somewhat in the front-end innovation ideation process. The biggest swing is around commercialization. It's that back end of taking the idea out of the design lab and the core development process and actually scaling it up for market introduction, full rate production, and global product launch. Those are the biggest swing areas in terms of low to moderate performance versus stellar performance. And that's, of course, where innovation becomes an issue of cross-functional coordination and the result of the entire enterprise doing well versus one function just doing well. And that pays dividends. What we found, and we use this, I apologize, it's true consultant-ese, coherence. And the idea of coherence is very tight alignment between business strategy, innovation strategy, the business processes, the capabilities in innovation you're going to actually invest in. I'm going to be really good at these 5 things, understanding customers, doing the transition to full rate production, whatever they are. Companies that get that singing and dancing tight level of coherence across strategy to capabilities perform better. They perform better in market cap, growth, margin, and the difference between being a low to moderate is not that big. The knee in the curve is getting a very high level of coherence, where I really have that a tight alignment between my product bets and my capability investments. And companies that do that have growth about 22% on a normalized higher than companies that are moderate to low. So it is a powerful influence if you get that tight level of alignment of what you're actually going to be good at. So let me talk about kind of 4 just capability areas to highlight. One is organization. And as a consultant, very frequently clients will say, oh, what we need to reorganize. And innovation being one of the most cross-functional of all processes in a company is something that people are always concerned about. Who should report to who? Where should the lines and boxes be? In a study we did a couple of years ago, we found that 50% of the companies we talked to had reorganized their innovation-related organizations in the past 18 months. And every time we look at it, it's pretty much people are constantly churning product management, product development. The problem with that is we find that structure is the single poorest predictor of organizational performance. That in many cases, the right talent and the right processes can work in almost any structure. And frankly, what we found is that the biggest influencers on organizational effectiveness are information flow. Who has access to what information? It may be customer information, financial information, having that access to that information, and then having decision rights around it. That those are twice as impactful as 2 other things, motivators and structure. Structure is the least. Basically almost any structure can work if you have the right people and process and decision rights. Interestingly, there may be a little pushback in this room, almost as bad or as worthless as structure is motivators, which is consultancies for money. This is financial incentives. And obviously you have to pay people, but in terms of actually motivating performance and innovation organizations, after a base kind of threshold of I'm not getting screwed, it's all about decision rights and access to information is really the big swingers in terms of performance. And people who've seen motivated teams, you can sort of understand why these things have more impact than just a bonus check. Not that people don't like bonus checks, but it's not as big a factor in organizational performance. Second area I'll just quickly touch on is portfolio management. This is an area we tend to call ROI squared, which is really the return on innovation investment. And the big point for us is that people have to proactively manage their portfolio, both linking it to strategy, but always challenging what's in the tail. Do we really need it? Does it have a chance of being a success? Could it ever move the needle? Because not only is it money being spent, it's talent that is being used for potentially things that may never succeed. And it's also a management distraction. I mean, one of the most powerful things Jobs did when he came back to Apple in the late 90s was in 2 weeks, he had the entire R&D portfolio reviewed. Everybody came in, presented in 30 minutes what they were doing, and in 2 weeks, he terminated 50% of everything under development at Apple. He didn't fire the engineers. He redeployed them on the projects that they thought they could win with. And out of that came iMac and a lot of other things that were already in the design portfolio. But he was basically intuitively doing what we're advocating, which is to always be challenging what's in the portfolio and to focus on a few things that could potentially move the needle. And this gets to what I tend to call a funnel versus a tunnel. A lot of large corporate R&D organizations have what I consider kind of ballistic R&D. Once I pull the trigger and start something, you're basically standing in front of a bullet if you try to stop it. It's going to go to market whether it makes any sense or not. That's not particularly effective for a lot of reasons you can all imagine. What we find is the most effective, both in terms of profitability and growth, is a funnel, which is constantly winnowing, lets a lot of ideas bloom, vets them, and systematically and ruthlessly kills them off over time, and then redeploys the people and resources to the things that we're going to do going forward. And that kind of portfolio, and the curve differs depending on what industry segment in you, but the basic philosophy applies. That kind of portfolio is not only a higher ROS, return on sales, higher margin, but over time drives higher levels of top-line revenue growth than one that a lot of things keep going that may not have a chance of success. Third area I'll just quickly touch on, which is the single biggest swinger in terms of good versus mediocre performance, is deep customer insight. And some companies, and the poster child, the overused example of Apple, continues to come up, that take a holistic market customer perspective and aggressively and proactively develop insight into end users versus people who have a more passive product-centric view, typically perform better. And the polar opposites is kind of Apple with its consistent investment in end user understanding versus a Bose. We all know Bose. A lot of us probably like their wave radio. But kind of typical kind of Bose example of innovation was when they decided to take all of the controls off the box. Then they figured, hey, it would be more elegant. It would obviously be a cost reduction. We'll put it all in the remote control. Well, they did that, and quickly, the #1 dissatisfier for Bose was the fact the controls were in the remote control, because people lost the remote control, and if you lost the remote control, you couldn't turn the radio on. Small problem, but innovation that became the biggest negative on the product, because they had a very product-centric, as opposed to an actual user understanding perspective on how people interact with their products. And why does this matter? Well, it matters because people who do this right make a lot more money. What we found is, and this again, I'll apologize because it's a qualitative scale of the level of direct end user insight people develop, but what we found is that people who do that to a very high degree have 3 times the average operating income growth over time, 65% higher TSR, and 2x the return on assets. It is the single most statistically significant relationship between good versus bad performance, is the level of end user customer insight. And the thing that's important, particularly for people who have companies or businesses where they don't directly touch the customer, is how are you going to develop that insight? Great example, not very sophisticated product, is Black & Decker. They own the DeWalt division, which makes professional power tools. They have a systematic process where their engineers, their product managers go to contractor sites, see how people build houses, how carpenters use their tools. In doing that, during the McMansion boom, they saw that carpenters were running all the moldings through the saws twice. And they're like, why the hell are you running things through the saws twice? That damages raw materials, it takes more time, it's kind of crazy. Because the biggest saw blade at the time was only 10 inches, which means it wasn't big enough to go through the wood they were cutting. And the carpenters were doing whatever they could. These guys knew that all they had to do, they could quickly re-engineer the housing, create a slightly larger blade, and they created the fastest selling new power tool for the professional market the next year. It wasn't a technology innovation, it was just realizing that customers who hadn't articulated a need that they realized was trivial to fix. And it's that same kind of approach that companies like Apple and others use to develop their innovations. Last thing I'll touch on is open innovation, which a lot of folks have been talking about in the last 2 days. I have a bit of a cynical view on this. I mean, you ask people what 10 people what open innovation is, you'll get 17 definitions of it. Sometimes there seems to be a bit of mysticism about, oh, it's open innovation. I mean, what the hell does that mean? To us, it means really just 3 things. Point 1, it's harder to be smarter than the rest of the world. Point 2, that you need a systematic process to reach out, surface, and most importantly, vet ideas from the outside. And point 3, and most importantly, you have to have an organizational culture that is open to other people's ideas. And there's a lot of companies we can all think of who were basically, if it isn't our idea, it must be a stupid idea. That no matter how elegant the process you set up, if the culture isn't there to accept outsiders, everything's going to be dead on arrival. And Apple, once again, everybody's poster child for goodness, is one of the best examples of that, because it's fundamentally a culture that respects good ideas. I mean, think back all the way to Macintosh, when they went to Xerox PARC and saw a graphical user interface. It wasn't their idea, but they knew it was a better idea. Same thing for iPod. It wasn't even an Apple employee who came up with the concept. Tony Fadell was a contractor, but they had a mechanism to surface and vet the idea quickly. And they said, that's a good idea. We don't care if we didn't think of it. We're going to go with it. And they had a process that said, we're going to be good at a few things. The user interface, the industrial design, the branding, the relationship via iTunes with the music companies. And then we're going to let a lot of other people who are better at this stuff than us execute. And that's real open innovation. But it's very much into a lot of hard-nosed operational processes. So with that, I'll get off my soapbox and just leave with you a few things. 1, innovation spending is not correlated with performance. It's all about strategy, talent, and process that make the difference in actual performance. There are 3 distinct ways you can approach your innovation strategy, and if you do them right and you align your investments right, you can be equally successful if they actually are coherent across the chain. What really matters is, what are your priority capabilities? What's the short list of capabilities, things you're actually going to be good at? And for those in the venturing kinds of roles, is thinking about what capabilities does the guys you're thinking of investing have and not have, and where do I marry up another set of capabilities with other investments or things other parts of the company can bring. You need to think about whatever your portfolio is as a funnel, that you're constantly winnowing the herd and redeploying, and do it ruthlessly and sooner rather than later. And not to confuse, remember on this point that maybe 15% of that $500 million of corporate R&D spend is actually R. Most of what we're talking about is D. It's applied development. So we're not killing the golden goose of science. We're talking about redeploying that 85% of classic engineering or applied development money. Decision rights and information flows are more important than structure. And that's much bigger motivators to people than throwing money at them necessarily. And the biggest kind of swinger of advantage is really end user understanding, because not only does that let you identify opportunities, but it lets the engineering teams actually intuitively know how to do requirements trade-off. And the last, I don't have to tell anybody this, that open innovation can be a powerful flow, but frankly, culture is the biggest issue in making it successful or not.
So Barry, this room is filled, not 100%, but largely with corporate venturing people. People who wake up, go to work, and they're thinking about corporate venturing in one of its many flavors. You haven't mentioned corporate venturing in your high-level overview, bird's eye view of how innovation works or doesn't work so well. So what is your view on the role of corporate venturing in innovation?
The simple response would be, it has the opportunity to be critical glue, to basically piece together parts of things that are happening within the company that you're working for, as well as with outside partners. And that glue can be, around relationships, funding, but actually helping to sort through, and we kind of have this hobby horse around capabilities of what does this venture really have going for it now, and what does it need? And it may need money, but it may need actual access to capabilities and to being very thoughtful and hard-hearted about what is and is not there in terms of capabilities. But having that perspective of what this team, because frankly, ideas are easy. Execution is hard.
So if you do have a corporate venturing group, and I know you think that structure and boxes and sticks don't matter nearly as much as process, do you have a view on whether the corporate venturing group can integrate into the innovation process more effectively if it's independent from the business units or independent from R&D, or somehow integrated explicitly into some part of the organization? Should it be aligned with staff or aligned with line?
The little bit of both. It does. I personally have never seen what I think most of us would consider a venture group that was embedded down in a BU that was successful over the long term. I mean, it needs a certain level of independence, but call it process, call it relationship, but being tightly linked with the business units as well as whatever the appropriate entities outside are, is key. And I think it's an element of that glue that I was talking about, is that it cannot be sort of a think tank of wonks that kind of runs off to the side. It has to be closely tied to what the business is and familiar enough that it's just not, hey, I need to do a corporate tax to fund my activities, that they actually understand the business objective and the operational capabilities of those respective units. So I think it's both. But I think it does need to be called out as an area of focus. It doesn't mean that that area of focus has all the resources under one box.
So the folks in this room who aren't corporate venturing folks, a large portion of the remainder, work on incubating. And incubation has been a topic of conversation for the last day and a half. Do you have a different view than what you said about corporate venturing, about incubation? Does incubation work well generally as an element in the mix for corporate innovation? Or is it something which sort of is an embellishment along the periphery?
It clearly has a role. It has a lot of larger challenges, the fact that it's outside. And to maximize actually success of something, going all the way to an introduced product, what mechanisms you have in place to link. I think you've got a lot of advantages when it's within a corporation. Clearly, there are certain disadvantages if it's the wrong place, because the core products that exist may swamp out the interest in some of these. That's why people have created incubators in the first place. I do think the kind of independent incubators that aren't actually part of it come to the table with a lot of disadvantages. It doesn't mean they're not insurmountable, and sometimes a set of relationships or just good luck can trump those, but I think the deck is a bit stacked against them in a lot of cases.
Questions from you folks? Anybody with a question? One in the front.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Tom Halley. Barry, thank you very much for an insightful presentation. I want to probe a bit something you said about information flow and decision rights being the most powerful influencers on corporate performance. And first I want to say, it reminded me of something I heard a couple of months ago, that our infantry is innovating in an area that they've referred to as moving power to the edge. The idea that in the types of conflicts that we're in, particularly I imagine in the Middle East, it makes sense to allow field commanders a greater degree of latitude in the decisions that they make so that they can respond more quickly. Is that what you're saying? Is it simply bureaucracy is bad for innovation, or is there something more subtle than that?
I wasn't exactly saying, what you just pointed out is completely consistent with what I'm saying. I think it's an example of that. I think it's a couple of things. It's not necessarily bureaucracy. And because sometimes it's not that it's bureaucracy, it's that we've got a centralized mode of operation. And that people are more motivated. I mean, we've all heard examples or seen them personally of within a corporate environment where somebody only succeeded with a new innovation because they were a hero. And they were a hero in that they were willing to basically beat their head against the wall, have the slings and arrows, and they were able to push it through. The more you basically give people decision rights, and this is at multiple levels. One, it's does a product line manager have discretionary authority to spend a certain amount of money to do an extension or something new? It's consistent when you look at the Google or the old days, HP, that a certain amount of engineers' time was basically spent however they saw fit to come up with ideas. I mean, even an old line company like 3M still has what they call their 15%, which is basically just a mantra of that engineers should be always thinking about something outside their job for innovations. And those are not necessarily bureaucracy or not bureaucracy, but it's an empowerment, and I hate the kind of new age kind of terminology, but to actually do things beyond the rote activities of the day. And that kind of mindset applies at the grunt engineer, at the lab bench, all the way to people who are product line managers or even general managers around, do they have discretionary slush funds? Do they have within their R&D portfolio multiple horizons? I mean, we'll go in and often see corporations that everything is Horizon 1, Horizon 2, pretty near in investments. But you can also set up corporate governance even at the division level where there's Horizon 1, Horizon 2, and then even much longer horizon things that should be in the portfolio. You should have a balanced portfolio. And you can argue, is it 5% or is it 20% that should be in that longer term set of things? But you can set up a structure around issues at the most junior person to the most senior executive with multi-billion-dollar product responsibilities that are consistent with that mantra. I don't know if that...
Raise your hand with a question.
You talked about it's very important to have, for the company to have a deep customer understanding. So I'm going to ask the question, who in that company should have the deep customer understanding? And who from two perspectives. One is the level within the organization, executive, middle management, engineer doing the work. And the second from the domain, meaning executive level, management, marketing and sales, engineering. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Great question.
Ideally, everybody. But we know that that's not necessarily possible. I'll have to admit, I'm a big proponent of that the engineers have to touch customers. And often you'll get sales and marketing organizations who are like, God, we couldn't show those people to the customer. But I think that's key. And I'll just throw out a couple examples to me that kind of represent the essence of what I think is important. I don't know if they still do it, but years ago when Dell used to require all of its design engineers to spend 1 day every quarter on the customer support line. And you're like, well, why do you have guys that are designing board layouts and stuff on the customer support line? And the reason they were doing that is to drive home the fact that customers have no clue what's inside the box. The things that drive customer satisfaction and what ease of use really matters, you guys are clueless about. And so they would get on the phone, and literally, I heard this tape myself, where somebody called up and said that they didn't know how to put the disk in to load the computer. And so this engineer is walking through the person, okay, well, open the door. They go, oh, the door's open. Okay, now put the disk in and close the door. And all of a sudden you hear these footsteps and you hear the door slam, and on this tape. And it was that the definition of ease of use was so low, and that they're thinking about speeds and feeds, and that there's a level of fact, but there's also a level of just internalization, because engineering is all around trade-offs. It's all around trading off requirements and figuring out where that sweet spot is of what I'm going to put in, and most important, what I'm not going to put in. And that requires direct experience with customers. There's a famous story when BMW, US sales organization, was fighting with Germany about putting both a sunroof and air conditioning in the cars. The sales organization got the German engineers to come over and drive from Dallas to LA to understand America in August. They came back and they knew that you needed air conditioning in the US, in US cars driving across the Southwest in August, because they had no personal experience in driving in America. So I think the key thing is for engineers to get direct exposure to the customer, and particularly the end user, because sometimes the customer is not the end user. I think product management needs that exposure. And the broader you can do it, the better. But I think that the big swingers in difference is companies that actually get the technical community hands-on experience with customers, and not as an event, as an ongoing way of behaving. That then you build a repository of direct experience, because you want to make it visceral for technical teams.
So Christina says we have time for one more burning, deeply insightful, crucial question.
We're too trivial. Yeah.
We need somebody with a mic to pick one of the people who looks most urgent.
I don't know if I can fit the bill of all of those requirements, but I do have a question. So I noticed that you didn't really specifically address the concept of corporate culture in your innovation process. How do you think about corporate culture in the context of that process?
It's very important because it's underlying a lot of the things we're talking about. I mean, the examples I was just giving, the whole idea of, will open innovation even be successful, our behaviors around. It's not an area we've delved into a lot. We know it's a big factor. It's a big driver behind both the talent and the process dimensions of what really makes a difference. It is actually the subject of this year's Innovation 1000, is to dive into the culture. And I'll just use an example. I was meeting with the CTO of 3M a couple weeks ago, and they have done what anybody in the room would consider open innovation just across their divisions and with third-party customers and universities for decades. It's just in the blood. Nobody argues about transfer pricing or cost transfer for engineers working on a project for a different division. It's just they don't know how to behave any other way. It's just in the blood. It's in the water there, and it's an element of culture. And actually, that's something that we're going to spend a lot of time this year as we do the 7th annual innovation to really explore the cultural dimension, because it is a big factor. Because I mean, the same company may have the same process on paper, the same structure, they maybe even the equivalent level of talent, and the culture is like a huge component between success and failure. And frankly, going to Apple once again, the reason Apple survived is the core group of people in the mid to late 90s when the company was collapsing. The culture was so strong, they stayed anyway. I mean, Jonathan Ive stayed with his team of industrial designers when everybody was trying to hire them, and right around when jobs came back. And it was the cultural dimension of why those teams stayed and still persevered and are still there today.
All right, thank you guys very much. Great questions. Thank you, Barry, very much. Thank you.